It's a bitterly cold November morning in 2018, and the forests of central Wisconsin are blanketed in fresh snow that crunches underfoot with each step. The landscape is pristine and seemingly untouched, with towering pine trees casting long shadows across the frozen ground. For most people, these woods represent the kind of peaceful wilderness that Wisconsin is famous for, a place to hunt, hike, or simply escape the pressures of modern life. But beneath this serene surface, hidden in a carefully concealed chamber carved into a hillside embankment, someone is living a life that defies all conventional understanding. This isn't a survivalist testing their skills against nature, or an eccentric hermit seeking solitude. This is a man who has spent nearly 2 years constructing what amounts to an underground fortress, complete with solar panels, water filtration systems, and stockpiles of food that could last for years. His name is Jeremiah Button, and he's not hiding from society by choice. He's hiding from justice. Keep this underground sanctuary in mind as we explore his story, because what he built in those Wisconsin woods represents one of the most elaborate and sophisticated attempts to evade law enforcement in modern American history. The engineering complexity of his hideout would impress survival experts, but the reason he built it will horrify anyone with a conscience. Jeremiah Button was born in April 1975 in a small town near Warsaw, Wisconsin, the kind of place where neighbours knew each other's business, and front doors were rarely locked. To most people who encountered him growing up, Jeremiah appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a quiet, slightly odd young man who kept to himself and didn't cause much trouble. But this unremarkable exterior concealed a mind that was developing dangerous capabilities in multiple directions. Jeremiah possessed genuine intelligence and technical skills that would have served him well in legitimate pursuits. He understood electronics at an advanced level, had mastered principles of mechanical engineering, and displayed the kind of problem-solving abilities that engineers and inventors rely on. Think of Jeremiah's mind like a high-performance computer that's been infected with malicious software. All the processing power and capabilities are there, but they're being directed toward destructive purposes instead of productive ones. By his late 30s, Jeremiah was still living with his parents in their modest family home, maintaining the facade of a harmless adult son who simply preferred a quiet lifestyle. His neighbours saw him as perhaps a bit eccentric, but fundamentally harmless, just another middle-aged man who had never quite launched into full independence. But beneath this carefully maintained appearance, Jeremiah was leading a double life that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. Between 2006 and 2012, while presenting himself as a quiet, unremarkable resident of his small Wisconsin community, Jeremiah was systematically committing horrific crimes against a minor who was related to him. These weren't isolated incidents or momentary lapses in judgment. They represented a sustained pattern of abuse that continued for 6 years. The crimes took place in his family's home, often while his parents were elsewhere in the house, completely unaware of what was happening. Jeremiah used his technical skills not just for legitimate purposes, but to document his crimes, creating a digital archive of evidence that would later prove crucial to his prosecution. This pattern of abuse is like a slow-acting poison that contaminates everything it touches. The immediate victim suffers trauma that will last a lifetime, while the entire family structure becomes corrupted by secrets and betrayal that no one yet understands. The abuse continued for years because of the inherent power imbalance between Jeremiah and his victim, and because of the isolation and secrecy that characterizes most cases of familial abuse. The victim, being young and dependent, had no framework for understanding what was happening or how to seek help. It wasn't until 2014, when the victim had matured enough to understand the true nature of what had been done to them, that the truth finally emerged. With tremendous courage, the victim came forward and provided testimony that would expose Jeremiah's years of criminal behavior. When law enforcement executed a search warrant on the Button family home in 2014, they discovered evidence that went far beyond the victim's testimony. Jeremiah's computers and digital devices contained thousands of images and videos of child exploitation material, creating an extensive digital footprint of his criminal activities. Perhaps most damning of all, investigators found video footage that Jeremiah had recorded himself, documenting his abuse of the victim. This footage was time-stamped and could be matched to specific locations within the family home, providing irrefutable proof of his guilt. This digital evidence operates like a black box flight recorder. It provides objective documentation of events that can't be disputed or explained away through alternative narratives. Jeremiah's own technical skills had created the very evidence that would ultimately convict him. The scope and systematic nature of his digital collection revealed someone who wasn't just committing crimes opportunistically, but who was methodically documenting and cataloguing his criminal behaviour over an extended period. Based on this overwhelming evidence, Jeremiah was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including child enticement and possession of child exploitation material. The charges were serious enough to warrant significant prison time, and prosecutors were confident they had built an airtight case. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him and the serious nature of his crimes, Jeremiah was granted release on a $25,000 bond, a decision that would prove to have catastrophic consequences for the justice system's ability to hold him accountable. The conditions of his release included surrendering his passport, being banned from internet access, and being restricted from leaving the area. However, these restrictions were largely theoretical, as Jeremiah was apparently free to travel throughout the state without direct supervision. This bond decision is like giving someone the keys to a getaway car after they've been caught planning a bank robbery. It provides them with exactly the freedom they need to complete their escape plan. For months after his release, Jeremiah appeared to be complying with all the conditions of his bond. He attended pre-trial hearings, met with his attorney, and gave no outward indication that he was planning to flee. To court officials and law enforcement, he seemed to be someone who understood the seriousness of his situation and was preparing to face the consequences of his actions. But behind this facade of compliance, Jeremiah was quietly executing one of the most elaborate escape plans in the history of American fugitive cases. In 2016, just 2 weeks before his trial was scheduled to begin, Jeremiah Button simply disappeared. Not gradually or suspiciously, he vanished completely and without a trace, leaving behind only a handwritten note for his mother claiming that he was heading to Florida to start a new life. Law enforcement agencies immediately launched an extensive manhunt, placing Jeremiah on their most wanted lists and following up on hundreds of tips from the public. But every lead resulted in a dead end, and investigators began to suspect that Jeremiah might have met with foul play rather than successfully fleeing. The note claiming he was going to Florida seemed too convenient and obvious, leading some investigators to wonder if it was deliberately misleading. Some theorized that he might have been killed by someone seeking vigilante justice for his crimes, while others believed he had access to resources and assistance that weren't immediately apparent. But the truth was far stranger than any of these theories. Jeremiah hadn't fled to Florida, hadn't been killed by enemies, and hadn't received help from accomplices. Instead, he had simply walked into the Wisconsin wilderness and vanished beneath the forest floor. For the next 3.5 years, not a single person would see Jeremiah Button, because he was living in a world that existed entirely underground. While law enforcement agencies searched for him across state lines and international borders, Jeremiah was living less than 150 miles from his family home in an underground bunker that represented a masterpiece of survival engineering. The bunker itself was located in the dense forest surrounding the small town of Ringgold, Wisconsin, carefully positioned on state land where it was unlikely to be discovered by property owners or regular visitors. Jeremiah had chosen this location for multiple strategic reasons. It provided the isolation necessary for long-term concealment, it was close enough to a county landfill for scavenging supplies, and it was positioned on a south-facing embankment that would maximize solar energy collection. The construction of this underground hideout had taken Jeremiah nearly 2 years of careful planning and execution. Using his engineering knowledge and technical skills, he had carved a chamber approximately 12 to 15 feet into the hillside embankment, creating a living space that was completely invisible from ground level. The entrance was concealed beneath a sheet of plywood covered with forest debris, making it indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Even someone standing directly above the bunker would have no idea that a sophisticated underground facility existed beneath their feet. Think of Jeremiah's bunker like an iceberg. What was visible above ground represented only a tiny fraction of the complex infrastructure that existed below the surface. The level of engineering sophistication in Jeremiah's underground hideout was remarkable, demonstrating both his technical capabilities and his commitment to long-term survival. He had essentially created a fully functional off-grid dwelling that could sustain human life indefinitely. Power generation was handled through a combination of solar panels mounted high enough above the tree line to capture maximum sunlight, and a stationary bicycle rig to generate additional electricity when solar power was insufficient. Battery banks stored this energy for use during cloudy weather or at night. Water needs were met through a combination of stored water jugs and a rudimentary filtration system that could collect and purify rainwater. A ventilation shaft provided fresh air circulation, allowing Jeremiah to remain underground for extended periods without suffering from air quality problems. Food storage consisted of hundreds of canned goods, dried foods, and preserved items that had been stockpiled over months of careful preparation. The bunker also contained cooking equipment, tools, and even entertainment systems, including a flat-screen television connected to both DVD and VHS players. Perhaps most remarkably, Jeremiah had installed a functional septic system to handle waste disposal, demonstrating a level of planning that anticipated years of occupation rather than temporary hiding. The entire structure was weatherproofed, with tarps and insulation, creating a living environment that could withstand Wisconsin's brutal winters, while remaining completely undetectable to anyone passing overhead. Jeremiah's survival strategy depended heavily on his proximity to the Marathon County landfill, which he visited almost nightly to scavenge for food, supplies, and materials. This location had been deliberately chosen during his initial site selection process, as it provided a reliable source of resources without requiring him to venture into populated areas where he might be recognized. His nocturnal scavenging runs were carefully planned to minimize detection risk. He would emerge from his bunker under cover of darkness, make his way to the landfill, collect whatever useful items he could find, and return to his underground hideout before dawn. This routine is like a nocturnal animal's hunting pattern, systematic, efficient, and designed to avoid contact with potential threats or observers. Jeremiah had essentially adapted to a lifestyle that was more animal than human, living entirely outside the normal social and economic structures of society. During winter months, when snow made movement more dangerous due to the tracks he would leave, Jeremiah developed techniques for concealing his presence. He would walk in deliberate patterns and use pine branches to brush away his footprints, creating the illusion that no one had passed through the area. Ironically, these very efforts to conceal his presence would eventually lead to his discovery, as the deliberate nature of the track concealment caught the attention of an experienced outdoorsman who recognized that someone was actively trying to hide their movements. Living alone underground for 3.5 years created psychological pressures that most people cannot imagine. Jeremiah's existence was defined by almost complete social isolation, with his only human contact being occasional encounters with hikers who passed near his concealed location. The psychological impact of this isolation is like sensory deprivation taken to an extreme level. Without regular human interaction, social stimulation, or connection to the broader world, the mind begins to adapt in ways that can be permanently damaging. Jeremiah filled his time with activities that could be conducted in his confined underground space. He watched movies and television shows on his improvised entertainment system, listened to weather reports and local news on his radio, and maintained his physical fitness through exercise routines that included using his electricity-generating bicycle. But perhaps most disturbing was his collection of children's shows and cartoons, which suggested that even in isolation, his criminal interests and psychological problems continued to define his mental landscape. The combination of technical achievement and psychological dysfunction, represented in his bunker lifestyle, demonstrates how intelligent individuals can use their capabilities in service of fundamentally destructive goals. In August 2019, after 3.5 years of successful concealment, Jeremiah's underground world was finally discovered by Tom Nelson, an experienced hunter who had been puzzled by unusual signs in the forest for several months. Nelson had first noticed evidence of human activity during the previous winter, when snow had revealed deliberately concealed tracks and other signs that someone was moving through the area while trying to hide their presence. His experience as an outdoorsman told him that these weren't normal animal tracks or casual human passage. Someone was making systematic efforts to cover their movements. When Nelson returned to investigate further in the summer of 2019, he discovered what appeared to be a hidden door built into the hillside. His initial reaction was uncertainty. He couldn't tell if he'd found an abandoned shelter or an active dwelling, and he was concerned about potential dangers if the space was occupied. After discovering the entrance, Nelson contacted law enforcement, but without precise directions, officers were unable to locate the concealed bunker. This prompted Nelson to return for a more thorough investigation that would finally expose Jeremiah's underground world. When Nelson pushed open the concealed door and shined his flashlight into the bunker interior, he he found himself looking at a fully functional underground dwelling complete with canned food, cooking equipment, electronics, and other signs of long-term habitation. And then, as his flashlight beam swept across a makeshift bed, he found himself staring directly at Jeremiah Button, who was looking back at him with equal surprise. The actual encounter between Tom Nelson and Jeremiah Button was remarkably anticlimactic, considering the elaborate efforts that had gone into concealment and the serious crimes that had motivated the hiding. Nelson, shocked by finding an actual person in the underground bunker, simply turned around and left without saying a word, then called law enforcement. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they attempted to negotiate with Jeremiah to convince him to surrender voluntarily. For approximately 20 minutes, he resisted their request to come out, telling officers that he was a wanted man and briefly considering setting himself on fire rather than being captured. But eventually Jeremiah made the decision to surrender peacefully. After more than 3 years of complete isolation, he appeared almost relieved to have human contact again, and his first comments to officers were about how nice it was to finally have a conversation with other people. This reaction reveals the psychological toll that his underground existence had taken on him. Despite his technical success in evading capture, the isolation had created a form of psychological imprisonment that was perhaps more punishing than actual incarceration would have been. Jeremiah's surrender was calm and cooperative, suggesting someone who had always known that his underground existence was temporary, and who was perhaps grateful that the constant stress of hiding was finally over. Following Jeremiah's capture, law enforcement conducted a thorough investigation of his underground bunker, documenting the sophisticated infrastructure he had created and seizing electronic devices that might contain additional evidence of criminal activity. The bunker investigation revealed the full scope of Jeremiah's engineering accomplishments and provided insight into how he had managed to survive undetected for so long. Officers documented the solar power systems, water filtration equipment, food storage areas, and waste disposal systems that had made long-term underground living possible. Perhaps more importantly, prosecutors confirmed that the original evidence from 2014 remained intact and admissible in court. The digital files documenting Jeremiah's crimes had been properly preserved, and his years as a fugitive had not compromised the legal case against him. This meant that despite his successful evasion of justice for more than 3 years, Jeremiah would still face the full consequences of his original crimes, with additional charges related to his flight from justice. In 2020, faced with overwhelming evidence and the impossibility of mounting any credible defense, Jeremiah Button entered a plea of no contest to multiple felony charges, including child enticement and possession of child exploitation material. As part of a plea agreement, some additional charges were dropped, but the remaining convictions were serious enough to warrant a substantial prison sentence. Jeremiah was sentenced to 34 years in prison, meaning he will be 74 years old before becoming eligible for release. During his sentencing hearing, Jeremiah addressed the court with what appeared to be genuine remorse for his crimes. He acknowledged that he had no excuse for his behaviour and admitted that he had been sick and out of his mind during the period when he committed the offences. Jeremiah also claimed that his decision to live underground in the wilderness had been his own form of self-punishment for his crimes, though this explanation seems more likely to have been motivated by fear of how other inmates would treat someone convicted of crimes against children. The victim's family expressed relief at finally seeing justice served, even though the delay caused by Jeremiah's flight had prolonged their suffering and prevented them from achieving closure for years. In August 2021, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources undertook the task of completely dismantling Jeremiah's underground bunker. This process required several days and a full crew of workers, as the sophisticated infrastructure he had built proved as difficult to remove as it had been to construct. The dismantling crew had to deal with not only the technical systems Jeremiah had installed, but also the extensive septic system he had created, which was still fully functional and required careful handling during removal. Once all of the equipment and infrastructure had been removed, the entire underground chamber was filled in with soil and debris, effectively erasing any trace of Jeremiah's 3.5-year underground existence. Today, the location where one of America's most elaborate fugitive hideouts once existed appears as nothing more than a slightly uneven patch of forest floor. There are no markers, no signs, and no indication that anything unusual ever occurred in that quiet section of Wisconsin wilderness. From a purely technical standpoint, Jeremiah Button's underground bunker represents a remarkable achievement in off-grid survival engineering. His integration of solar power, water filtration, waste management, and long-term food storage created a self-sustaining environment that could have theoretically supported human life indefinitely. The sophistication of his concealment techniques, from the invisible entrance to the strategic positioning that maximize solar exposure while minimizing detection risk, demonstrates engineering capabilities that would be impressive in any context. But this technical achievement is forever tainted by the criminal motivations that inspired it. Jeremiah's engineering skills, which could have been used for legitimate purposes that benefited society, were instead directed toward evading justice for horrific crimes against a child. This case illustrates how technical intelligence and criminal behavior can combine to create uniquely dangerous individuals who pose threats to society that go far beyond what their surface appearance might suggest. The case of Jeremiah Button raises important questions about how the justice system handles accused individuals who possess unusual skills or resources that might enable them to evade prosecution. His release on bond, despite the serious nature of his charges and the extensive evidence against him, created the opportunity for one of the most elaborate and successful fugitive operations in modern American history. The fact that someone could disappear completely for more than 3 years, living within 150 miles of where law enforcement was searching for him, demonstrates both the limitations of conventional manhunt techniques and the advantages that technical knowledge can provide to determined fugitives. Jeremiah's case also highlights the importance of considering not just an accused person's criminal history, but their capabilities and resources when making decisions about bond and pretrial detention. Someone with advanced technical skills and survival knowledge poses different flight risks than typical defendants. The psychological profile that emerges from Jeremiah Button's case reveals someone whose intelligence and technical capabilities were fundamentally disconnected from normal moral and social development. His ability to engineer sophisticated solutions to survival challenges contrasted sharply with his inability to understand or respect basic human boundaries and rights. The crimes he committed against a family member demonstrate a profound lack of empathy and moral reasoning, while his elaborate escape plan shows sophisticated planning and problem-solving abilities. This combination of technical competence and moral dysfunction creates individuals who are particularly dangerous because their capabilities exceed their conscience. His 3-year underground existence also reveals someone with extraordinary tolerance for isolation and discomfort, suggesting psychological characteristics that enabled him to endure conditions that would break most people mentally and physically. The fact that he ultimately seemed relieved to be captured suggests that even his impressive technical achievements couldn't overcome the fundamental human need for social connection and meaning. Throughout this entire saga, it's important to remember that at the center of this case is a victim whose childhood was stolen by someone they trusted, and who was then forced to wait additional years for justice, while their abuser lived as a fugitive. The courage required for the victim to come forward initially, and then to maintain their commitment to prosecution even after Jeremiah's disappearance, represents a strength that deserves recognition and respect. Jeremiah's flight from justice didn't just delay his own accountability, it prolonged the victim's suffering and prevented them from achieving the closure that comes with seeing their abuser held accountable for his crimes. The ultimate resolution of the case, with Jeremiah receiving a 34-year prison sentence, provides some measure of justice, but it can never undo the years of additional trauma caused by his successful evasion of the legal system. The Jeremiah Button case provides valuable lessons for law enforcement agencies about the challenges posed by technically sophisticated fugitives. Traditional manhunt techniques, which focus on monitoring transportation hubs, financial systems, and communication networks, proved ineffective against someone who had completely disconnected from modern society's infrastructure. His successful concealment demonstrates that individuals with survival skills and engineering knowledge can create hideouts that are virtually undetectable using conventional search methods. The fact that he was ultimately discovered by a civilian hunter, rather than professional law enforcement, highlights the limitations of systematic search techniques in wilderness environments. Future cases involving technically capable fugitives may require different approaches that account for the possibility of long-term wilderness survival and sophisticated concealment techniques. Jeremiah Button's story represents one of the most unusual criminal cases in recent American history, combining horrific crimes against a child with one of the most sophisticated fugitive operations ever documented. His technical achievements in survival engineering are forever overshadowed by the criminal motivations that inspired them. His underground bunker, which took years to construct and could have sustained him indefinitely, ultimately provided only temporary escape from consequences that were always inevitable. The justice system may have been delayed, but it was not denied, and Jeremiah is now serving a sentence that will keep him incarcerated for most of his remaining life. The victim in this case has finally received the justice they deserved, though the additional years of waiting caused by Jeremiah's flight added unnecessary trauma to an already devastating situation. For the law enforcement officials who spent years searching for him, his capture represents the successful conclusion of one of the most challenging fugitive cases of their careers. For the community he terrorized with his crimes, his imprisonment provides assurance that he will never again be in a position to harm children. And for anyone who might be tempted to see Jeremiah's underground survival as some kind of impressive achievement, it's important to remember that it was built on a foundation of child abuse and was motivated by a desperate attempt to avoid accountability for inexcusable crimes. The patch of uneven ground in the Wisconsin wilderness, where his bunker once existed, serves as a reminder that even the most elaborate attempts to escape justice are ultimately temporary, and that the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried.